Did you know that while Shiraz or Syrah is indeed indigenous to France, the vineyards of Shiraz in South Africa have been planted with clones that were originally isolated in a number of different countries around the world. In the 1970s, Vinytech brought in clones from Argentina, but then they were also producing clones from South African vines that had originally come from France, but then undergone some epigenetic evolution of their own. Then in the 1980s and 1990s, as the global brand of Australian Shiraz grew, so Vinytech began bringing in clones from Australia as well. And finally, also in the 80s and 90s, as the renown of Rhone became what it is today, Vinytech thought it would be a good idea to bring in some clones from France in order to give us a little bit of that French magic to our South African Shiraz. But horror of horrors, it was discovered that almost all of the clones that came from France possessed a bizarre disease called Syrah decline. Syrah decline causes Shiraz or Syrah vines to swell at their graft points, and then a kind of necrosis sets in the trunk, and the leaves turn red and the vines die. This meant that almost half of all Syrah clones available to South African grape farmers had to be discontinued in order to avoid this gnarly vine disease. This also goes some way to explaining why old vine Shiraz is perhaps a little bit harder to find in South Africa than, say, old vine Grenache or old vine Cinsault. Now, Syrah decline has been documented in France for a long time, but it was really only about 20 or so years ago, when it became a problem for the folk in California, that any real sort of research or investigation began into this weird disease. For a long time, even the Californians tried to pretend that what they had was Syrah syndrome, which was different to Syrah decline, but in the end they had to acknowledge that there was indeed Syrah decline in California. And so there was this 20-year-long kind of collaboration of super sleuth work and disease investigation. But as of 2022, despite all of that collaboration across the ocean, they still know very little about either the cause of the disease or even its process. Luckily for us, the hand drink soda wine of the day is the Cape of Good Hope Riebeeksrivier Shiraz 2018, which is a Swartland Shiraz made with vines grown from clones that were isolated in South Africa, Argentina and Australia. So we don't need to worry too much about Syrah decline just yet. Riebeeksrivier Shiraz comes from the Riebeeksrivier ward, which is one of the 8 wards within the larger Swartland wine district in South Africa. The ward lies stretched out on the western flanks of the Kasteelberg. And within the Riebeeksrivier ward, you will also find Riebeeksrivier Farm. And this is where the fruit for this particular wine comes from. And if you're trying to figure out, well, what kind of neighborhood is this? Well, it's worth noting that the famed Elandskloof have vineyards just next door. If you poke your head around the other side of the Kasteelberg, you will see a little town called Riebeekkasteel, and surrounding Riebeekkasteel is the wine ward of Riebeeksberg. And Riebeeksberg is a ward that is home to people like Alles Verloren and Mullineux and Pulpit Rock. The Cape of Good Hope wine range had its genesis out of the fact that Johann Rupert was part of the founding initiative in order to get the Old Vine project on the go. He funded the project that Rosa Creer was spearheading, and part of this project was to actually send teams out into the South African winelands trying to figure out how many old vine vineyards there actually were out there. Along the way, they discovered some absolute gem vineyards, hugely distinctive, and whether this was because they had extreme altitude or perhaps were just very, very old vines, or were situated on a marginal slope on some desolate mountain, or, as is the case with today's wine, a combination of almost all of those factors, the team felt that they couldn't not express what they discovered. And so outside of the Old Vine project, the Cape of Good Hope wine range was born in order to express these vineyards. Now, while all these bizarre and wonderful vineyard sites are found dotted all over the South African winelands, all of the fruit from those vineyards comes back to the Anthony Rupert wine facility in Franschhoek, where they are vinified. Now, the Anthony Rupert winemaking team has a number of winemakers on it, but the man who is responsible for vinifying all of the red wines, and therefore today's Shiraz, is winemaker Vernon van der Hoefer. When we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, I mean, it really is about as extroverted as a club bunny on E. There are just waves and waves and waves of black plum, black currant, even black currant pastels, and much fresher blackberry fruit as well. But you can see the components are fairly ripe. Then over above that, complicating it delightfully, are touches of cocoa dusting, some vanilla spice, and even a hint of white pepper. And when we give this guy a sip, well, delight of delight, the palate is every bit as warm, inviting, and generous as the nose. It makes a superbly regal entrance with these rich, velvety elements of that black plum and also the cocoa dusting that we spoke about. But then, almost immediately, as if to steady the wave of ripe black fruit, there are also some delightfully fine but firm sort of plum skin tannins that hold everything in place. But these don't stick out by any means. In fact, they've been beautifully integrated over the fact that this has been in bottle in the cellar for at least 4 years. And then the tail has an element of generosity too. That more vibrant blackberry fruit that kind of held the rest of the fruit up really does linger beautifully, and you get a touch of that sort of vanilla and pepper on the tail as well. So as you would have experienced, the fruit on this wine is ripe, and it really speaks of the warm sunshine of the Swartland region. But it wasn't slouchy. As I said, there were those delightful sort of juicier, brighter blackberry elements that held everything upright. And this is probably partially because the vineyard sits at between 400 and 450 meters above sea level. Now this changes the way that the fruit will ripen. It does this because of things like diurnal range, and I've made other videos that talk about this. So if you want to know more, I've left a link to that video below. When it comes to the fermentation of the grapes, Vernon ferments the Shiraz in a combination of stainless steel tanks, but also in concrete. Now, traditional knowledge would say that it's those stainless steel tanks that are kept protected from oxygen that really will preserve those brighter, more vivid fruit elements. But Vernon seems to feel that the concrete tanks really are the components that bring that real bright liveliness on the mid palate. And so this might explain how you can have a wine that really is quite ripe, but not at all mushy. And then when it comes to maturation, the wine was in barrel for about 12 months, which again goes some way to explaining those touches of cocoa dust and vanilla spice that we smelt on the Vanguard. And finally, the fact that it has been in bottle for almost 4 years explains how those tannins manage to be firm, but also fine and silky. So that's all we have time for today, but if you have any questions about Syrah decline or fermentation or barrel aging, then leave a comment on the website below and I will try and get back to you. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.